up on his headphones. We're going to hit the blue go live button. And we're live. It is Friday, August 5th, 2022. Wow, this is the longest we've ever, I think this is the longest we've ever had. No, it's not. Okay, whatever.
I think I hold the record for 22 minutes.
Oh, really? Nice. Yeah. So we're only 13 minutes late, people, and Ben's not here. No one has to tell him. Shh.
No.
We have Alicia, we have Genevieve, and we have joining us again. I don't even think I'm in the right vicinity. Oh no, I think I have to go like this. Maybe this way. Is Will Dewitt, one of my oldest friends and a doctor of clinical mental health at I'm kind of named it, but an unnamed health clinic in New York City. But he's not speaking on behalf of that health clinic or anything else. He's just speaking in his private capacity as a doctor. And we are here to talk about the newest health crisis in the United States of America, which is has some competition, to be fair.
Yeah, polio.
About monkeypox. And I think that there's lots of questions, and I've been wanting to do this for weeks with Will. But Will, welcome back to the show. The last time you were here, you were working in a COVID hospital for the homeless and mentally ill. And so doing God's work.
Jumping one thing to another. Yeah.
It is nice to have you back.
So I have a quick question. How accurate would you say the news is in reporting it? Because I imagine that conditions are very different. Just to get started. Actually, let's pause on that. What is monkeypox, Will?
Yeah, so monkeypox is a virus. It's in the same family as smallpox, which is why there's a lot of crossover talk about that. And it was initially kind of only found in Africa, and mostly was a zoonotic infection, meaning it went from animals to people. And there wasn't much human-to-human transmission, and then something changed, and now it is exploding in Europe and in the United States. I think the United States actually just took over as the #1 spot for confirmed infections. And yeah, so it's this, in some ways it's known, and in some ways we're still learning.
So because there's some history with it, this isn't something that came out of nowhere like COVID. There have been some preparations, and the United States has had cases of this before, I'm assuming, but not to the level, because I think I saw some infographic that there were only 2 states that don't have active cases currently.
Yeah, that they know of, right?
Right.
Yeah, because testing has been a big issue. So definitely something that we know. And there's actually some really kind of pluses to that, and the biggest one is there's actually an FDA-approved medication that we're using off-label for it, currently under kind of a stringent code through the CDC, but there is medication, and then more than that, there's a vaccine. So that's kind of the big pluses. And then you're right, there have been cases sporadically in the United States, one actually associated with prairie dogs. So there's some poor picture of this little prairie dog pet who's Jake with the prairie dog infected a whole family with monkeypox.
Oh, poor Jake.
Back in the 1990s. But this seems to be, this does feel like something different too. And there's been definitely, even just how the disease is acting, both transmission and how it presents, it feels like it's a little bit different.
So one of the things that Genevieve said really quickly was oh, this is so different, it's different kind of like COVID. But the interesting thing that you did say was that monkeypox is a derivative of smallpox in the same way that COVID is a derivative of existing coronaviruses. Right. So there is an extent in which the contagion and the ability for it to spread and the rapidity in which it's spreading is new and is new in the and in terms of the pandemic or endemic qualities that it possesses. But one of the things that you and I talked about a couple weeks ago that I think is super interesting was specifically the way in which it's spread and whether it's labeled as a sexually transmitted disease versus other types of disease, bloodborne, or I don't know. You are the doctor, so I'm going to shut the fuck up and let you actually but what is the, like, when we talk about things like AIDS as a sexually transmitted disease, or herpes
HIV,
as a sexually transmitted disease, when obviously herpes is actually not sexually transmitted technically, like, it doesn't have to be. It can be bloodborne. It can be like you can get it from kissing someone who has cold sores, right? Like, what is the terminology and labels? What do they do? Like, what is the purpose of that? And can you just explain that really quickly?
Yeah, so I think that is kind of a debate and kind of a hot topic, especially in social media, and like how people are talking about this. And yeah, so I can tell you, like medically, right, like that. In some ways, it feels like splitting hairs, in that I think it's important to note that it can be spread in other ways, but especially this outbreak, it is like predominantly like there's the New England Journal of Medicine article that associated, so it was like I think 95 or 98% were associated with sexual activity. And I can tell you, as someone who's seen, and like both me and all my colleagues at work, we've seen a ton of cases, and I can't think of one that hasn't been associated with sex. I mean, there's definitely exceptions, and the exceptions prove the rule. Like some like a handful of household contacts, and we know that's possible. And especially with kind of like if you live with someone with it, there's like prolonged contact. But yeah, it definitely. And then the other kind of like technicality is like skin to skin. So we definitely know that you can get it by touching the lesions directly. But the thing that we don't know, and like one of the things that's like maybe different about this time, is that we're still kind of waiting to hear if it can be transmitted directly through bodily fluids, so especially semen and rectal and vaginal secretions, and also orally. So, so far we do know that it does. It's easier to be infected if you have broken skin or a mucosal surface, right? So it kind of makes sense. That's in like some of the guidelines too. So it does need like a route, and sex just happens to be like a very efficient route to get in contact with some of those places.
Not to be super weird, but like when you have a lesion, is that technically like a bloodborne? Like, does it depend on the scale of the lesion, or like what's going on? Is it bloodborne, or is it mucosal, as you said, or is it like lymphatic? Like, what is actually going on when you have a lesion? Like, what is like the actual route of transmission?
So it probably is like a direct transmission. Like it is like kind of like syphilis. Like there is a chancre. There's like a point of entry, and that is like a direct infection in that spot. But then you're right. Then it kind of like it can get disseminated. So it gets like spread all over the body via the blood is a possibility, and is like almost definitely true, because people get this like kind of rash all over the place that has like detectable virus in it. But unlike say like HIV, which is really kind of like blood transmitted too, and like really need access to specific tissues and like borne along by bodily fluids, there is like an element of skin to skin for this, and also fomite too. Yeah.
So my internet connection's pretty bad, but earlier on, did you say in the 90s there was a family that the prairie dogs bred it?
I don't know if it was the 90s, but it was some time ago.
I'm just curious, because it sounds like, I mean, there's obviously a higher risk the closer in contact one would be, including intimately, but there are other ways in which one might catch it,
bites,
including from a pet. Would that just be like they're getting too much up in the poor pet's face? We're coming back to a different show. I'm sorry.
I mean, honestly,
this show was destined to be like this, by the way. There was no way this was not going to be about sex and poop and like.
So you asked the prude to come on. It's amazing.
Really, your hair looks great, by the way, Alicia. So.
Coming back to vaccines then. Okay, I'm going to leave alone the prairie dog.
Well, that's an interesting question, because, I think it is like, especially like the previous monkeypox that we knew, it was mostly through like animal bites, right? So like prairie dogs are nippy, and you get nipped by your family prairie dog. So it's like that. So even that, it's not like you're rubbing up on the prairie dog. And the other thing that's important to note, that monkeypox is a misnomer too, because the reservoir really is probably rodents and not monkeys. Monkeys are also just like, so non-human primates are like us, like can get the infection, but we're really not like kind of the reservoir for the disease. So it's kind of an interesting, sidebar. But yeah, but I'm not like a super expert on like the zoonotic stuff. So yeah.
Fair. I get obsessed with it. It's the whole cute aggression problem and getting the animals up in my face. The more serious question on vaccines is I thought I read that the smallpox vaccine it gives some measure of protection. Is that the same vaccine that's used? And if it is, when did they stop giving it? And how do you know if you have it, like the vaccine,
Yeah.
as opposed to monkeypox? That's a separate
Yes.
question.
Totally. Yeah. So it is the same. And it's not just like extrapolated kind of evidence from smallpox efficacy to monkeypox. There is some direct evidence in both kind of serology studies and animal studies that it works for monkeypox as well. But it is a smallpox vaccine. It's a newer smallpox vaccine. So the old one actually had like an attenuated like live virus, and you could actually give it to other people if you didn't take care of the little scab that it formed. And that's like one way you know you could get it is like people who had it usually have like a little divot where they got it because it forms a little scar. And it does, like, I can say like both anecdotally, but I think it's also in some of the guidances, but it does cause some protection. Like people definitely get it, but it tends to be like less severe. Like we saw one person who had the smallpox vaccine and they had like just literally like one bump on their finger and that was it. And like that was their entire disease course. And I think stopping it, I don't know exactly, but I think it was like, I would say 70s, like maybe early 70s. Yeah.
I read it was 1980.
Okay. Yeah.
And I asked because like I don't have it. My family all has the mark. I'm assuming they never gave it to me.
Yeah. I feel like my Gen X cousins, like I haven't seen the mark on them either. So, but yeah, who knows? Like I'm sure that answer is out there. But yeah, there was like a definitely a marked point where that stopped. And the other kind of silver lining about that is that there's really good data that if you get one dose of the vaccine, you're very well covered if you have a history of the initial smallpox vaccine.
So actually, I have a quick question, kind of piggybacking on this before I go back to like my original question. Does this
Guinea
make
pigging on this? Is that
no piggybacking? Guinea pigging, no prairie dogging. What
Yeah.
rodents?
I like prairie dogging. I'm gonna prairie dog off of this.
I have like a sheep in my upper, like whatever. Go ahead, Genevieve.
No, it's totally fine. But just kind of, does this make? Sorry, now I'm all giggly. But does this make transmission tracing kind of difficult? Because I assume in vulnerable populations, which we can talk a little bit more about later, you have a differential in how covered they are. So someone who possibly could have been exposed but was older and was given the vaccine may not even know that they're infectious and could be transmitting to someone who's, say, younger and possibly has less protection, if none at all.
This is a good question because I mostly think that Will is going, and I'm going to predict the answer here, is say that there's like almost like a negligible amount of people who have been given the vaccine.
Oh, I meant including the smallpox vaccine.
Oh,
too.
including the smallpox vaccine. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah.
The one that they're dishing out like it's like super candy. Like that's got so many questions. I'm sorry. Well, please.
It's okay. Wait, so I think just to understand the question, so you're saying people who maybe had the smallpox vaccine as a kid and now have it, but maybe have a very like attenuated disease course, and like they could possibly give it, and you're asking if we should worry about that? Is that
yes?
correct?
And just how could that be challenging in not just this population, but other populations of vulnerable people who are being exposed?
Yeah, so I think that's true in general too, right? Like that's just one way that people could have a very mild disease course. I think just kind of like COVID, like dosing matters, like how much you were exposed and then what your body does with it. And I think it's important to say that a lot of people have very mild kind of cases, even though the new data is saying that like 10 to 13% of people wind up in the hospital, which is also upsetting.
Yes.
But yeah, so it's kind of like it's definitely like a range. And I think that might even be part of what's driving it is like there's been kind of an emphasis on the people. And it does feel a little like early COVID to me. They're saying that only people who have symptoms can transmit, and especially people who have the rash can transmit. And for me, that's like actually kind of a huge open question. And we really don't know if you're going to be infectious, prior to symptoms, which is like really what we like know for sure with COVID. And you're actually maybe most infectious when you're like a day before symptoms hit. And then also how infectious you are, lingering after the rash resolves, especially if there's live virus in bodily fluids. But then more directly, yeah, even people who are like, like that one guy who had like one thing on his finger. And the other thing is like, it's really horrible is that it is like this imitator. Like monkeypox looks like so many other things, and like even things that people are used to, like like herpes, or like people get like little bumps like eczema on their fingers, right? And I don't say that to like, and I worry about saying things like that because I don't want to freak people out. And there is like kind of a certain classic, like already, like I have a pretty good visual diagnosis for monkeypox because it really does look kind of specific. But if you're not used to that, and even then we still get fooled. But it can look like a lot of other things. So I think sometimes people have it and don't realize it.
One more question on this, and then all you, Kate. But is it difference? But does it present differently or look differently? Because I know sometimes skin conditions can look different on different people of different races. And
Totally.
how is educating going in that, or is it just field experience that people are starting to see it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's like definitely a known systemic problem. And I like follow an Instagram account called Brown Skin Matters because it's like a very well-known issue that it's incredibly hard sometimes to diagnose like very classic even skin rashes on people of different skin tones. So that's a great point. And yeah, absolutely, it definitely can look different. Like erythema, so like the redness looks entirely different on lighter skin versus darker skin. So sometimes you have to go off of like induration or like how it, like for me monkeypox, the biggest thing is like how it like looks and feels. Like usually it's like very indurated, like it feels like there's like a little BB underneath like each little pox, and that kind of speaks to like the inflammatory effect of it. Unlike like more kind of like superficial, like if you do have like a contact dermatitis or like you're allergic to something and you like break out in like red bumps, but a lot of those red bumps are very small and not very kind of like firm. But that's like it is like I even know like saying this like that's kind of a subjective like wishy-washy, and unless you're like seeing it, it's hard to tell the difference. So I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah, just trying to unmute. Okay. So other than scarring, are there long-term health effects if you catch monkeypox?
Yeah, I mean that's like another biologic humility. Like we don't totally know. Like I would say we still don't know about COVID, right? Like we could all have like 50% increase in heart attacks.
Don't say it.
In
Please,
10 years.
don't say that.
Like I'm totally prepared for that. Like I had terrible COVID. I was like, oh, like my heart is just fucked now. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I can swear.
You can. Well, no,
Yes.
we say
Yes,
that
you
all
can.
the time on this show.
It's very fucking
fine.
encouraging.
Yeah, very fucking normal.
Okay.
But Will,
That's why I'm here.
You had like, yeah, Alicia, calm the fuck down because literally Will has had COVID like 15 times. It's like if anyone's gonna die, it's gonna be my best friend, and like I don't like yeah, it's like terrible. I mean, like it's actually very stressful. Like I don't know, but
Yeah.
But like we don't know this about anything. Like who would have imagined that chickenpox leads to shingles? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
people,
Good point.
but like there's a great example of like people who are vaccinated or people who have a mild case, or rarely some people who have a very severe case as a child, but they're very young or something like that.
Yeah.
All develop shingles later. It's just like I just think that there's a lot not known about the like virology generally.
Totally. Yeah. But I can say like right now, one of the big concerns is eye involvement, so ocular involvement, because it can happen there, and there's been a handful of people where that is true. So that's obviously like a little bit more scary for like permanent changes. And I can also just say like yeah, like the one another like kind of the most common severe presentations is proctitis, and I'm the clinical director of anal health at Callen-Lorde, so I've heard and seen a lot of those cases, and it's really intense, and I feel like that amount of inflammation, there's bound to be some kind of, at least like lingering issues.
Is that very painful for them?
It's insanely painful.
That's horrible.
Like,
yeah, I really hate to ask you to do this, but can you explain a little bit what like clinically as you can, like what proctitis is? Because I think that like there have been a few descriptions on the internet about it, but I don't think that they've done a great job of like kind of like laying out what the symptoms are.
So proctitis is just like fancy words for inflammation in the anal canal and rectum, and it like so what happens is like people get a ton of lesions there, and then they can become confluent, meaning they all kind of merge together, and so you just have this like basically your entire rectum and anal canal is one open wound, and then you have to have a bowel movement through that open wound. And it's also interesting too because one of the medications that has like, and this is like totally anecdotal and there's no real evidence, but gabapentin, and that's a nerve pain medication. So it seems like, and that makes sense to me because like that place is actually very intensely innervated towards the end, like so more in the anal canal. and it causes like that inflammation just causes this like excruciating pain, and then it's like horribly humiliating, and yeah, it's just like obviously a sensitive area too. So then when people have bowel movements, I've heard people talking about like they're just like lying on the floor crying for 2 hours afterwards. So it's like this pain, and like they talk about the pain kind of like starting in the anal area, but then like radiating up their back and down their legs. Yeah, and just like it takes their breath away.
Does this create also, like, because of the location, like a greater chance of like subsidiary infections or derivative infections?
Absolutely, yeah. So super infection is one of the main other concerns, and I've seen that too, not just anally, but like on the penis and genitals. Yeah, and that's like yeah. So because like your body's kind of like struggling to contain this infection and this inflammation, it opens you up to other infections. And like one of the things that we've seen that's also confusing is there's a lot of kind of like comorbid or like at the same time there's also herpes like kind of comes out because herpes is this like opportunist and it's like me too when things are like not going well.
Yeah.
And so there's a statistic about 30% of people have another infection when they're having monkeypox at the same time. And I'm sure that's like partly because of the like yeah you're kind of vulnerable when things are so inflamed.
I don't mean to like, sorry, it's like we're being a little graphic, but I also kind of think this is kind of a clinical discussion. And it's like, this is just like what happens. And like, this was a show with a doctor about monkeypox. So like, that is like literally what you bought in for, folks.
It's also important because I don't think people are talking about this.
No, they're not talking about it. The other thing that I kind of really want to say is that like what Will just said, which is super important, which is like the way that it builds on itself. And the thing that you kind of highlighted, which I think, and this is something I want to ask you about, Will, which is like, so Biden yesterday, timely, just named monkeypox like a national like health crisis. Right? Was crisis the right term? I think that is the term. I don't actually know what that means in terms of what it means for releasing funds to like fund this, but it means for releasing things for like the vaccine. We all know that like there's some like cave that has all of these like vaccines with like smallpox, and there's all of these doses and none of them are being released. Yeah. And this is primarily hitting like the gay population in particular. But like all of that I want you to talk about, but one of the other things is kind of like just very, very like kind of at the very head, like one of the reasons that like COVID became a global pandemic was because of the death rates at which like it was contagious and then people would die. And so like to Genevieve's kind of question as a follow-up, like, are people dying from monkeypox, or is this just like horribly painful and debilitating in this way that like no one should have to go through, and we don't know the long-term repercussions of this on their nervous system and like anything else?
Totally. Yeah, no, that's like it is like a complicated silver lining that the majority of people it's mostly okay. There are people who are having these like kind of horrific disease courses, and I would say actually one of the main kind of advocacy things of like I hope that stepping up this like idea of a crisis is that it can go the medication, especially like people deserve to get that medication, and like anecdotally I can tell you it's incredibly effective. And I think it should go from like right now it's an investigational new drug, and I think it should go to an EUA, so the emergency use authorization. I can't talk.
Wait, but what is the drug?
It's TPOX, so it's tecovirimat, and TPOX is an antiviral, and it has been validated and against smallpox specifically, and then there's been like lots of safety data. So it's not like like in some ways it's different from COVID because we already have all this data, and then it works. Yeah. But definitely a silver lining that the mortality rate has been very low. I think I might kind of quote this, but I think it's about 4 people in Europe and the United States. I think they've all been in Europe too. And like specifically people who are immunosuppressed. So it's people who are vulnerable in that way. I think the mortality rate was a little bit higher when it was more in Africa. But that has been a little bit different here, probably because of different, infrastructures in place and those big inequalities between those two places.
Genevieve, Alicia, feel free to like jump in. I'm going to start bringing in questions. There are so many good questions. I mean, like the main thing that I think is super interesting, well, speaking from, so John, well, Will knows because we've talked about this, but John, my partner, does all of this jujitsu in New York City on these mats. That is like, no, it's like, but like we've been like don't laugh at me. You're not allowed to.
It's okay. It's a thing. It's definitely a thing.
And like we had the last time we were here, we had this long conversation about whether or not like there was any type of like threat to basically like doing kind of that type of activity, which is part of why I'm like, I mean, one of the things that I feel like growing up, I didn't properly understand was that like I thought that if I had sex, I was always putting myself at risk for HIV. Even if I no matter what kind of sex. I mean, this was I think like a little bit of like a dare campaign, but for
Totally.
like for sex that was like, and AIDS, which was like, I mean, I remember actually like being 16 years old and never having had like being like inexperienced and like going and giving blood at like a donation site and being terrified that they were going to reject my blood because like, I mean, I was like so scared of this thing.
Yeah.
And it was this boogeyman that existed
Totally.
for like most of my childhood. And so I feel like there is, I just kind of feel like there is this very, I don't know, like the idea that another disease is like kind of seizing the gay population and then we're kind of extrapolating out from there just like strikes me a little bit like it just like kind of like conjures up something from like my childhood. Does that make sense, Alicia?
That's what I was wondering. I mean, I didn't know how to frame the question, but I was wondering like how much, let's call it PTSD from the 80s and 90s and a lack of response and a framing of this as being a problem for only a certain percentage of the population that's already stigmatized. Like how is a community that has been disproportionately affected by HIV AIDS and this feeling in this? I mean, I think that there's got to be a whole lot of baggage if there's baggage for the likes of us who were just kind of growing up.
Yeah, it's not even like I was ever real risk for this thing, although I didn't know that at the time. But like, this is like, yeah,
same. I have the same weird baggage from that. And I remember like bawling in the early 90s because a grandmother had got HIV AIDS from she developed AIDS eventually because there wasn't obviously the treatment then from a major blood transfusion issue that happened. And so it was like it was widespread. Everybody was being affected. You didn't know who was, going to get it. And I think as children kind of watching everything via media starts to scar you, but that's like we aren't even like the population that was most affected. So all of this comes back. How is the community dealing with this?
Yeah, no, I mean honestly, it's incredibly traumatizing, and that's I think really apparent. Yeah, and there's definitely echoes like both like so even though it's not super lethal, it is incredibly scarring, both literally and metaphorically. And yeah, no, and I think that's even like kind of in the kind of the crux of like it's not like I think there's like a very real and I think a very reasonable fear of stigma, right? And maybe monkeypox isn't super lethal, but stigma definitely can be. So I think it is like I think there's like this kind of like both like a personal trauma, but then also this like fear and anxiety of what linking this new disease and this kind of highly already kind of stigmatized disease to the gay population will have like very real world consequences. And I think that and it's like that stigma can be more lethal than the actual disease. So yeah, and you can see people struggling with that. You can see government agencies struggling with that. You can see community agencies struggling with that. And you can see individuals struggling with like how to message and how to talk about it. Yeah, I think it's right to kind of engage with that struggle, but I fear like we also need to be honest about what we're dealing with, and like and right now like it's overwhelmingly linked to sex, and it's overwhelmingly kind of like in this specifically kind of cis gay male world too. There's like definitely exceptions to that. And that's very important. But it really is. And I feel, yeah, and so it's hard not to feel targeted by the disease itself, right? And that's like,
Yeah.
and we still have that with HIV, right? Like when I give people a new diagnosis, one of the first things I say is like, you know, you didn't do anything wrong, but this is now your responsibility, and you have to take care of it. And because people like immediately go into like, what did I do? Like, why did I get this? Like, I clearly deserve this, because that's what we're told, right, from a young age. Like even now, right?
Yeah.
And that's like the messaging.
I just
And yeah,
want-
so yeah, so
Just
that's heavy, but
a quick thing on the messaging though, and I this is more of an opinion question. You hit on so many things that are so important to talk about, and I apologize, Kate. But
Yeah.
the one thing I wanted to ask you is if you, because you're on the ground, you're seeing this, if there would be like two things that you think could really improve the messaging, or two things that you think they're doing very well or very poorly, it's your pick, but how would you like it improved?
Oof. Yeah. I mean, I'm like, I think we're in this conversation right now. So I think given, yeah, so knowing that it's kind of like a work in progress, I would say I think it's important to come to grips with that it is linked to sex, because I think that allows people to make better choices and like shape their risk better. And also like people, you know, because I've had a lot of friends who are like don't want to go on the subway because they're like afraid of sitting on the same seat as someone, and like that's just a weird whole other like, yeah, like, so I think people are just like miscalculating a lot right now. So I think being very honest and like, and you know, and that could totally change, but the data currently is very overwhelmingly pointing to it being sexually related. And I think in some ways suppressing that is stigmatizing itself. Like having sex is awesome, and like having gay sex is super awesome. And again, right now it just fucking sucks because monkeypox is very much in the mix. Um, and yeah, and I think you can hold both of those ideas at the same time. So I think it's like a misdirection. And then I think so. And then I think part of that is also not losing the stigma part of it. So I think still holding on to the importance of talking about why stigma can also be incredibly dangerous, but separating it from the idea that we can't talk about that this is related specifically to sex. It might even be related specifically to gay sex, and that often is a corollary to anal sex. And we don't have any kind of information. Like there's some like a little bit of information I can think about. Like, you know, I see and talk about and like do butts in distress all the time. Like that's like my main gig. And I can think
What's
about
in
ways.
distress? It's a
Yeah,
really good band
hashtag.
name.
Yeah, butts in distress. Yeah, and I could think about ways why that's true. Like the anal canal is incredibly, like it's thin-skinned, right? And the mucosa, unlike the vagina, where the skin is much thicker and the mucosa is way more kind of buried, anal canal, like both, like it's thin-skinned and the mucosa is right there. It's two knuckles inside. So just like mechanistically, right? So it's not about like anal sex is like the devil's work. It's like anal sex just provides pathogens with a unique entry point, and that sucks a lot. And also means like, you know, like even though I have to have like whole conversations about how to have anal sex that doesn't hurt you, and that's because of those unique properties, right? And it doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, obviously not. But we do need to come to terms with like what that means. Yeah, and so I think like separating that out, and I think yeah, it's like holding on to both of those truths that like we need to like combat stigma, but we also need to be real about like how and why this is happening.
Yeah, I think that's like a really, I'm going to say like a really fun story, which I've shared with you before, but I was like, when John and I were long distance between Boston and New York way back in the day, which Will heard a lot about at the time. We were like on this, I was like on like a Bolt bus or whatever it was, but a Funghua, like what, and like, I will never forget that there was like this one time that there were like these two old queers like sitting behind me, and they were like, "What's your T cell count? What's your T cell count? When were you diagnosed? When were you diagnosed?" And they were, it was like very cute, but they were like obviously like living and like living very robustly, like older. They were like in their 60s or 70s, like with HIV or AIDS. And like,
yeah,
the fact that it had gotten to that stage, and they were like trading stories of watching people die, and it was obviously very sad, but there was also like this part of what they were saying that was kind of like how they'd survived and how they made it through. And like, there is a huge part of like this monkeypox thing that feels, I wanted to ask you really like specifically, do you feel like it's being I mean, you weren't an adult like when AIDS was happening, you know, like, and everything else. So I don't like know what you felt
You mean
like.
the height of it,
Like,
totally.
basically, do you feel like it's like, do you think that the political kind of response to it and the lack of like release of the smallpox vaccines or taking it seriously is like political in some way because it is being labeled like some type of gay disease, at least right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is not, obviously it's not fully equivalent. Like, it's not Reagan who won't say HIV, right? Like, that was horrific for years. And the scale and the stakes are a little bit different too. But absolutely, yeah, I think there's no question in my mind that the sluggishness of the response is in some ways due to like, you know, I don't think it's like an active kind of homophobia, but it's definitely kind of a passive, like implicit bias and a callousness. Um, yeah, and again, I think, and there's also, and maybe that's another thing I would say about messaging is I think there's a real concern about like talking about reducing your partners and like not having sex. There's a fear that that like puts the onus on the people who are most at risk and the people who are bearing the most burden for this disease. And it would kind of like get people off the hook who need to be stepping it up right now. And I'm sympathetic to that, absolutely. But I think we can also hold that kind of as like a separate issue too, and like also talk about how to manage your risk in the moment.
There's so much of the misconceptions of how it's transmitted that remind me so much of the things that were going around in the
Totally.
late 80s and 90s around how it could move. And
Yeah.
I'm reminded, because I'm really old, of the Life Goes On episode where
Yeah.
the daughter brought home her friend who was positive. And there was this whole education campaign of like, you can't get it from the plates. And I mean, it's a little sad to me that now, what, like 20, 30 years later, we're still in this place where something new emerges and our immediate worry is like, we can't go on public transport because this is how it's transmitted. But obviously, like on the scale of transmission, this thing is like way lower than COVID and Ebola and even meningitis from the sounds of it. Like,
totally.
Why are we freaking out so much? That's a psychological question. I'm so sorry.
I mean, Jesus, like it's been like one plague after another. So I think everyone's like just like specifically this, like everyone is just primed to have like a freak out about it. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Like I feel that. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? Is like what I thought when I first started hearing about this. So like, yeah. So yeah.
Do you, and this is really speculative, but is there any correlation to people's immune systems already being weakened because of COVID that is making something like monkeypox maybe a little bit more infectious than it might have been?
Yeah, I mean, that's a super interesting question. So like co-infection, yeah. So like if you had Omicron in the last month, like are you going to be set up to getting
or like kind of what you just said about how herpes is an opportunistic like virus. When your immune system is weakened, herpes decides to pop out of the fucking woodwork. So
yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question. Yeah, popping out the woodwork.
Genevieve, were you herpes in this scenario? Like just kind of like
well, you know, any viral infection. How you doing?
Seriously, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I said the thing. Yeah. No, and in general, right? Like, there's tons of interesting questions. And I think there are like definitely a hierarchy of like interesting questions of like what's like most pressing about like what we need to know like yesterday and like we should have known yesterday. And that's also super frustrating that like there just isn't the like, and also like just in terms of like COVID, like what the hell? Like we just set up all this infrastructure specifically to like deliver vaccine and medications and information. Where the hell did that go? Like what? Like the like rollout of the vaccine, like, you know, I always like I give a lot of credit to the DOH in New York City. Like I think they are always like I think they're often like on the forefront of things, like poor them. Because they're like often operating in ways that like don't have the support of like that they should. But like it was such a shit show at first. And I'm like, guys, like you literally just did this. Like I was in those vaccine pods. Like what? I don't know. So that was just super specifically frustrating.
I think that that's a great point. We have a ton of questions, none of whom are from people that can come on screen right now. So I'm just going to kind of like scroll through and ask them. But should vaccinated members of the mainstream media communities, I think MSN means mainstream media, maybe it means something else. I don't know. MSM community still exercise. I don't know. What does MSM mean? Does that mean like
Men who have sex with men.
Oh,
Mainstream.
mainstream media? Should
Oh, we are in different circles,
use
Kate.
exercise discretion? Rachel Maddow, exercise discretion. Okay, should men who have sex with men community still exercise caution when it comes to going to nightclubs or popular vacation destinations like Provincetown? It has been hard to find literature on whether we should continue to isolate to stop the spread. So this is kind of like what you were saying. Sorry, I noobed out.
Recovering.
Jesus.
Wait, so should MSM isolate? Is that the
Sorry,
question?
normally when people use MSM in this question and answer / chat, it is always referring to mainstream media. So I just I was
I would have done the same.
okay, sorry.
No, I had a similar moment recently. Someone is like SW, and I'm like, oh, social worker. They're like, no, sex worker. Will. Sorry.
See,
Yeah.
yes, okay.
But yeah,
so
so should
what do
people
you think?
isolate? And it's like specifically people who got vaccinated should isolate. Yeah, so I think, in general, yeah, if you're someone who's vaccinated, you don't, I mean, and also if you weren't vaccinated, like, I don't think if you are MSM, like, you can go out in the world and do your thing. Like, I think it really is, like, there's no kind of, like, the evidence is very much pointing towards, like, there's not really any risk with casual contact, right? So, like, it's more for me, and I think I would say for most public health people, it's really the focus on people who have the infection, and also managing your risk when it comes to very intimate contact, like specifically sex, right? So yeah, no, I don't think gay people need to become shut-ins. If I'm understanding the question correctly.
Do condoms do anything to prevent the spread?
Yeah,
or
so
is there-
speaking of no, that's like a great, that's like way up on the hierarchical need in terms of like what we need to know. Because if there is virus that is able to infect folks in the semen or in the semen, in semen or in like rectal secretions, like rectal mucus, then condoms would probably work, right? But if it's more like HPV,
lesions around the groin area or something.
yeah, but like HPV, like condoms aren't super effective, and that might be a similar kind of thing. If it's more skin to skin only.
What are all the ways to avoid catching this? And now they're coming up with new acronyms. They're like one away from saying moral searching lawyer, MSL, I'm pretty sure.
I'm like, I don't think that I can be held accountable for that. It was, I actually do know that acronym, but I completely blanked. Anyways.
In my world, MSM is always mainstream media, and somebody's usually ranting about it and saying it's not credible and whatever else. So I feel you. We're fine. What are all the ways people can protect themselves from not catching monkeypox?
Yeah, I mean, I think the majority of the public, there isn't much reason to be super concerned. I think it's something to watch, but I don't think you need to change most of your practices. Obviously if you live with someone who could be at risk, there might be a conversation around that. But even that, I would hesitate to be too kind of stringent on it. So I think most of the idea of protecting yourself has to do with, and I think that's what I was saying about we need to be realistic about what this actually is right now. And so I think most of the conversation about protecting yourself should be more around sexual partners and how we're having sex.
What will it take if they allow for smallpox vaccines to be kind of released or more manufactured at greater scale or something? Is it going to be the type of thing that it's a one vaccine and done type of
yeah
thing? What does that look like for smallpox or smallpox derivatives like monkeypox?
So if it's going to be a one-dose vaccine or if we need multiple, or when the rollout is going to look like? Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the 1 versus 2 doses is a super interesting question, and most places are moving towards a one-dose strategy. And that's because of this kind of animal and serology evidence that this newer vaccine could match the protection level of the older vaccine after one dose, after about a month or so. And that the second dose is really for longevity, right? So like it might protect you for a while. But honestly, like that is a gamble. Like I think it's a gamble. Like I support it personally because I think that evidence is pretty good. But I think with the caveat that if we see in the real world that it's not working, which is I think the missing piece right now, that we like really need that kind of like real time efficacy data that's not happening yet. And like anecdotally, I've seen people who've gotten cases like a week or two after vaccination, right? So it's like especially not effective right away. And like, you know, maybe those people's disease course might have been altered, but they're still getting it after a week or two. I haven't heard anything beyond a week or two.
Can I also ask what the incubation period is? Is there any idea?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. So that's like one thing we do have from that case series from the New England Journal, and that's like, so average is like 7 to 10 days. And sometimes you get the prodrome with like the fever and sore throat and like swollen lymph nodes.
So like
before the
in
rash.
theory, couldn't you do like have sex with
Yep,
men
exactly.
every 7 to 10 days and just make sure you clear out? Oh, sorry. What,
Yeah.
Don't laugh at that.
No, sorry.
That's
Yeah,
not
it's like that. I like the
funny.
scheduling. It's like it's not
Okay,
7
I
days
know
cleanup
that's
period.
not typical of like a man and like
Yeah.
like a single man in like the gay community, but like, I mean, you could.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like the thinking. Yeah, no, it's tricky, right? Like I think it'd be hard, and also because the incubation period can go up to 21 days, right? So unfortunately, there are outliers, and often like recommendations are more based on the outliers, like when can you know 99% instead of like 70% sure. So I think, and the other thing about like that strategy that makes me really worried is like we're one huge blind spot is we don't know if you're infectious right before you start having symptoms or if you're infectious after you have symptoms. So I think I wouldn't advocate for that strategy for risk management until we know more. Yeah.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to wrap, which is from Linda, who asks, is there any knowledge about how monkeypox got from a disease spreading in Africa over years to it spreading across the world? Like, is there any knowledge about this?
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting academic question, and also it's so relevant. Like why is this happening now? And it also like will probably be interesting and important for future. Like, are we in the plague years, right? Like, is this like now the new normal? Like so many other things are the new normal. And I think that's like a really important question, both with COVID and now with monkeypox.
Wait, what is the plague years? Is it just like one? Like, is it just like?
Saying.
Yeah, but like, what is it? Like, would it be like a period in time in which like viruses are like morphing at a rate that like we can't possibly keep up with, and that makes it like
it's the end times, the apocalypse.
Alicia.
Yeah, so
I'm more optimistic, guys. Come on, it's not end times.
Okay,
it's just the ill times.
I also believe in science, right? And like that's partly why this is so important to figure out, and like why that question is important, like for the aftermath, right? Because I think it's very reasonable to think that we are way more vulnerable to repeat pandemics. Like it is unprecedented globalization and unprecedented mobility. So there's like so like that's the question, right? Like why is it happening? Why is it happening now? And like why are we having back-to-back
from TikTok
plagues? Did you get monkeypox from TikTok?
Okay.
Yeah, that's
like no one clip that and make it a thing and then like spread disinformation about monkeypox. Don't do it, or TikTok. Like don't do that. But like
it was a digital get down.
TikTok with the toilet challenge around COVID, and it's the height of idiocracy for our society.
TikTok.
TikTok toilet challenge to get COVID in the beginning.
Oh, I see. I got it. Yeah. I missed that trend.
I missed that trend. I'm really glad that I missed that trend. I did not see that. I don't want to know, Alicia. Actually, like, just keep that to yourself. I'm not even going to Google it. Your hair looks great, though.
I was going to Google it for you.
No. Just stay there and look good.
That plague part. That part of the plague has passed. I don't want to revisit. Now we're in new plague.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, now that we're on to the new plague, and I know that we did start like 10 minutes late for the show, but I think we're going to end kind of on time. Mostly because I think people are done talking about the new plague. But I do hope that this was educational and helpful. I think it's fascinating. Oh, there is one more question from Arizona registered nurse who would like to know that there is apparently a case that is non-sex related among transmissions in Illinois between a female child care worker and like, I don't know if you know anything about this. And so this is kind of a little bit like on par with what I was kind of saying about jujitsu and everything else before, which is like, well, like what is like, if you're just kind of like leaving the lesions juice on a mat or like doing whatever, like why is that so different? And so like, I don't know, like, do you think that this is kind of one of the beginnings of like all of the weird ways in which like people caught AIDS and HIV that were not necessarily sex and not necessarily blood transfusions?
Yeah. Right. So yeah, like that's absolutely expected, right? Like we definitely know it can be transmitted in other ways. But for me, I think about it as like efficiency. Like that's an incredibly inefficient way for it to transmit. So there are going to be exceptions, and those exceptions will be newsworthy. But even like the fact that they are is like kind of like proves the rule, right? Like that's not the exceptions are what get the attention. But I think one way to kind of like frame this too is like, so if like we actually were kind of like missing something and it was getting transmitted in other ways and we just like weren't missing and we weren't seeing it, we would expect much higher positivity rates. Like when people do get tested that aren't, cis gay men, we'd expect like a much higher percentage of positives, but those numbers have all been incredibly low. So for me, that's like another piece of evidence that like for whatever reason, and it fucking sucks and it's unfair, but specifically gay men are vulnerable, probably because of the way we have sex. And that's like that sex is okay, absolutely. But it does make us particularly vulnerable, which sucks.
It's like it's a different, well, there might be a point in time in which like there are developments in like the human body that like, I mean, like how, I don't even know how long it took for like all of the ways that you described, like the membranes and the mucus lining of like the vagina to develop. Like, I'm sure that they're like, anyways, to be discussed later at another time when everyone is feeling as cringy after this episode as I am not actually feeling cringy even a little bit. Like this is like barely scratched my surface of like things that make me uncomfortable. But I do understand that like it might be different for other people, but I'm really glad we had this conversation. It was super interesting. Also, just on an anecdotal level, how many cases have you seen in this week, would you say?
Like personally, my own patients, like maybe 3.
Okay. Out of how many patients?
Oh God.
Like hundreds?
No, but I mean, I see people for lots of reasons, right?
Okay.
And I'm like a procedure person, so like it's not my main thing, so I only have a smattering of urgent care. So like maybe out of like, so yeah, it's like it's definitely a preponderance. Like it is like a lot out of like the percentage, but maybe that's like it's hard because like I do booty procedures most of the time for people who are okay.
Yeah. Sure. But yeah, no, it's out there.
But I can say like in my clinic in general, it's like everyone, like you can tell because people have to put on like full PPE to go in. So you're like, oh, another monkeypox. And there they go. That's happening constantly. So it's like a constant thing. And my clinic has about 10% of all the cases in the city. So we're seeing a lot of it.
Do you think it's underreported currently?
Of course. Yeah. And like, I think the positive rate in that population like tells you that it's like super high positive. So if we were like testing people and missing it, then it'd be a lower positivity rate. Yeah. And I think the other thing I just want to say before we sign off.
Doesn't need it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I would say I think generally like it sucks and there's a lot that sucks about it and there's a lot of sucks that like surrounds it. But in general, I'm also like optimistic, right? Like there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And it's scary and it like, why is this like plague on plague? But I think there are a lot of reasons that like we'll be in a much different place much faster compared to COVID.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that like hopefully there will be a release of some of the smallpox like cash for vaccination, and then like especially given the World Health Organization and U.S. kind of identification of the crisis. But I don't know, who knows? But it does seem like it would be a great thing to do off the bat. And yeah, it seems pretty awful, even if you don't die from it. There are some things that are almost that bad. So like, which prostatitis kind of sounds like.
That's
So
bad. Yeah,
yeah, it seems really bad. But we will leave it there. We will be back on Monday. What day is that going to be? August
8th?
8th? No. Oh yeah. Oh, it is August 8th. Sorry, Genevieve. Yeah,
It's Monday.
August 8th with Jack Balkin to talk about the Supreme Court, to talk about constitutional crises, and to talk about the DOJ and prosecuting Trump. And that will be, I don't even know how many hours from now, but until then, Genevieve.
We don't have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we have Teco Viramat and hopefully, possibly emergency use authorization. I'm just going to keep putting that out in the world so that more people get help faster and less plagues. Please.
Yeah.
No more plagues, people.
Please.
Faster responses.
Let's figure it out.
We've got it.
We could have gone
for it now. Sorry, go ahead.
We could have gone for you could have the fun of a monkey, but do it safely.
No monkeys. No
Prairie dogs.
monkeys.
Prairie dogs.
Wrong.
I'm a monkey. I am a monkey. Born year of the monkey. I am owning the monkey now.
Okay.
Yeah, just
My
because
life.
you want to like make out with a monkey because of cute aggression does not mean that you should.
I am
make
a
out with
monkey.
a
Is that what cute
because of-
Am, literally.
I don't know. Eat it.
We're all
like
a little
whatever
monkey.
she wants to do with the cute aggression. We won't. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.